Nintendo's first true attempt at a 3D platformer, and arguably one of their most iconic games of all time, was Super Mario 64, released in 1996. For the first time, players could control Mario with more degrees of freedom than ever before and explore a wide variety of worlds. The game revolves around the castle, as it contains entrances to all of the levels in the game. Given the wide variety of options available to the player all in one place, and the mountain of new 3D mechanics that the player will need to become familiar with, Nintendo had a lot of work to do in order to make players not feel overwhelmed by this huge transition. Nintendo expertly avoids any potential frustration that such a transition could bring by gently nudging the player toward the intended path, while also giving players the opportunity to experiment through breadcrumbs and weenies, camera-based wayfinding, and satisfying backtracking, culminating in a gameplay experience that is memorable and leaves players feeling in control of their environment. The game begins with Princess Peach telling the player to come to the castle. The player is then given a tour of the space containing the castle entrance by Lakitu, which gives players a good idea of their surroundings without making them have to stray off the intended path. As Mario spawns, the camera orients itself automatically toward the castle so that the player has a direct line of sight to where they need to go. This prevents any skills they may need to acquire to get used to the camera controls from interfering with players figuring out basic movement. The unavoidable text box tells the player how to jump, attack, and move, although it doesn't get into specific movement options, of which there are many, leaving space for the player to figure things out on their own. Given that the player cannot just hold up from the starting position to get to the castle door, they will have to experiment with different movement options at a very beginner level. If the player decides to jump over the fence keeping them from the water, then the moat will gradually push Mario back near the start of the area. The rest of the area is surrounded by walls, and overall the lack of playable space with the clear castle weenie visible from almost all directions makes the goal obvious, and the means of getting there simple and forgiving. When the player touches the bridge, they prove that they can move forward, left, and right, so the next unskippable text box tells the player how to use the camera in a simplified manner. The camera movement is introduced after player movement because it is difficult to understand and can really hinder player movement, especially for those not familiar with 3D space. From the bridge, Mario can walk straight to the door. Once inside, the player hears Bowser laughing, increasing the sense of fear and urgency, and providing a refreshing contrast for players who may have felt bored by the tutorial. No matter which way the player decides to move through the castle entrance to investigate what might be going on, the camera will focus on the entrance to BLJing Battlefield, which is the only level that requires no stars to enter. By guiding the player to their destination using camera angles, the game effectively limits exploration, which, at this point, may frustrate players more than help, as they can't go anywhere else, and their grasp of the controls might not yet be great. In case the player doesn't grasp the subtle camera shift as a hint, there's a toad directly in the same line of sight that tells the player the same information. Entering the painting room, there is a set of stairs leading to a taller platform that perfectly frames the painting as important. And walking up to the painting, it will ripple as Mario comes into contact with it, suggesting that it has a water-like quality to it and can be passed through. One jump is required to enter the painting, meaning that the player now effectively knows how to move left, right, and forward, as well as jump, and this has been taught to the player with subtle camera movements, weenies, and set pieces that promote various kinds of movements. As the player spawns into BLJing Battlefield, they are presented with a clear path to follow that takes advantage of what the player already knows. On the first part of this path, the player is confronted with a Goomba, which they can either choose to run from or jump on, something that the game assumes players will know from older Mario games, providing a satisfying moment of recognition for the player, increasing their sense of agency. With the Goomba out of the way, arrows, dirt paths, fences, and bridges continue to guide the player. A chain chomp spurs the player onward to keep them moving, reinforcing the linear path that the game is trying to establish through this complex space. If the player were to fall off the upper level at any time, there is a very easy path to get back on the main intended route, and all other paths are blocked by a gate or a slope. Falling bubbles continue to spur the player onward in spaces where exploration is more of an option, emphasizing the desire to push the intended path in light of their minimal skills. Given that, the rest of this level serves as a learning experience to get players where they need to be for the challenges coming ahead. Boulders impede the rest of the player's climb to the summit, testing their abilities to strafe, run, and jump. Once at the top, the camera automatically focuses on the boss of the level, King Bob-omb, guiding the player to interact with them. The king tells Mario to get behind them and throw them to win, but Mario hasn't been told how to throw yet. Given that the player was told that B can be used to attack enemies, and that there aren't many more buttons on the controller, the player will likely try to press B. This moment of discovery is incredibly satisfying and gives the player a sense of agency in this complicated landscape. To further reinforce this feeling of discovery in the face of minimal obstacles, the boss moves very slowly when Mario sneaks up on him, but they will need to jump over him to get out of his line of sight, making this battle satisfying and challenging for the player, which culminates in them receiving their first star. At this point, the player has learned that they can figure out the world around them on their own, and in addition to many of the skills that the player has been directly taught, this toolkit makes them ready for the expanded world to come. In the text box that comes after, the game tells Mario which doors in the castle are now unlockable, and the camera pans away from Bob-omb Battlefield, both signaling to the player that it's time to try something else. At this point, the player can choose to either enter Bob-omb Battlefield again, go to Whomp's Fortress, or the Secret Slide, giving the player access to a wide variety of experiences on the condition that they are now familiar with the game enough to handle the more complex spaces. Whomp's Fortress provides more challenge to the player through the environment design, whereas the Slide is a simple path to the end that serves as a nice break for those who got frustrated by Bob-omb Battlefield. Still, Whomp's Fortress gives the player an explicit path to follow, although it's significantly more complicated than Bob-omb Battlefield's. For those players who saw the Power Star behind the Chain Chomp's gate while taking the main path through Bob-omb Battlefield, they may want to re-enter the painting to try and get it, now that they feel more confident in their skills. In starting the path again, however, the player is stopped by Koopa the Quick, who wants to race Mario for a star. This gives the player the opportunity to really make sure that they can move quickly through a level and are fit for the challenges that come ahead. The path is the same, but the addition of the change in music and the idea of an intense race make traversing the same space again feel fun and exciting. Upon leaving once more, the camera again pans away from the painting, nudging the player to move outside their comfort zone. Regardless of whichever way the game nudges the player, after the first star, there are always multiple paths for the player to take through the rest of the game. Given that the game only requires 70 of the 120 stars, players can skip many stars that they find too challenging in favor of more fun levels. Each level continues to teach Mario new skills, as well as increased platforming challenges, but the majority of the skills utilized are refinements of those taught to the player at the start of the game. The camera subtly guides the player towards important objectives, and in certain situations, away from familiar territory, cultivating a sense of adventure in the player's mind. The environment frames critical set pieces by utilizing architectural features, such as weenies, as well as clear paths. Strong enemies, in addition to the fencing off of power stars behind those enemies, give the player the desire to revisit old areas with new skills. The Koopa the Quick race teaches players that every level re-entry brings something new, further encouraging exploration. The legwork that the game does to engineer a linear yet compelling tutorial environment that empowers players enables the game to truly flourish and experiment with a wide variety of ideas because they've ensured through their design choices that the player understands the basics of the game. This trust between player and designer encourages the ingenuity of both, creating a gameplay experience that leaves the player feeling in control and content with making their own discoveries and decisions, all of which have been lovingly included by the designers for this very purpose.